is
It
very
baffles
invested in
me.
this kind of stuff.
Being on Twitter has baffled me. I've never thought this many communists existed in my life. I always had the assumption of this. Communism, like fascism, is an ideology that was tried and utterly failed in the 20th century. And it lost to, you guessed it, capitalism and liberalism. Liberalism and capitalism did a 1-2 combo and killed both those ideologies. And that's why it's predominantly the global ideology across the developed world. So I'm just sitting here thinking, like, why are you still a capitalist? Why are you still a fascist? Like, didn't you guys lose already? Like, I look at them the same way as I look at, like, Confederate LARPers who are like, oh, yeah, the South will rise again. I'm like, look, man, I love my Southern heritage, too. I'm from Georgia. But, like, the South isn't going to come back. We're not going to reclaim a whole territory. Like, let it go. Like, give the times type thing.
Yeah, this kind of reminds me of, because I just finished reading The End of History, and it's and the premise of the book is that, well, basically I don't necessarily agree with like the thesis, but the thesis is that kind of the end point is liberal democracy and liberal capitalism, but then and that and like kind of the Western status quo or whatever, but at the end he does concede that like there's basically people have a need to like have conflict and to feel like they're fighting for something greater than themselves, and that's what like and so it's never, so there's still going to be a lot of like, there's always going to be like LARPers or like people kind of replaying, like there's a certain kind of person that has like nostalgia for like for these ideologies because it makes them feel like they're fighting for something greater than themselves or whatever, or it's like because it's like revolutionary. And so I feel like that kind of almost vindicates kind of Fukuyama's thesis, because it's like we're in a point in time, at least in the West, like, or even in like the US, for example, where things are actually are not actually. I mean, of course, probably a lot of people disagree with this, but I think this seems to me that democracy and the kind of capitalism are pretty stable. And they're not on the verge of going away, but people think they're on the verge of going away because there's a lot of exposure to like LARPers. And I would argue,
it's Silver. You don't know how many times I'll be in a space and it'll be some frantic like 18-year-old communist that lives in like upper middle class suburbs being like, don't worry guys, capitalism's gonna end any day now. America's gonna collapse. You just wait. We're gonna rise up. I'm like, sure you are, buddy. Sitting in your mom's basement. Like, and I was just like laughing at them. Like, have you ever killed an animal? Have you ever had to gut something for food? Have you ever went hunting? Have you ever grown your own garden? Have you ever done literally any basic survival task? And then they're like, oh, I order ramen from DoorDash. Yeah, capitalism is so bad, bro. And I'm like, yeah, sure it is, man. Like, you keep doing you, buddy, talking on your iPhone on a Twitter space while eating anything at your fingertip. Literally, you have a phone in your hand. You get whatever you want through that.
Well, the funny thing is they always come up with these like historical like counterfactual arguments, like, oh, if the West hadn't like done some embargo in like 1953 against East Germany, then today, communism. Because what they're not understanding is like sure, like in any number of like, we can never know like what would have happened if X, Y, and Z had happened in 1960 or whatever, but like the vulnerabilities of the systems of communism, fascism, the Confederacy, these political systems that failed, were just intrinsic to those systems. So, like, the fact that they were defeated, right, like, and all of these circumstances led to their defeat, right, like, so, like, why did the Soviet Union collapse? Like, you can come up with a lot of reasons, but and a lot of things that the Soviet Union could have done better to maybe last a little longer, like, for instance, not invading Afghanistan in 1980s. But the problem was that the system had all these kind of internal issues that were going to lead to collapse eventually. And so, like, it's like it's kind of like the excuse of like a strong wind blew it over. Like, well, it probably wasn't that strong of a system anyways. So that's you're right, because they were. So that's and that's just an interesting thing and that's one of the things that I think that Fukuyama did well in the book, is talking about how democracy has grown over time because it is evidence of the fact that it will continue to grow because it is a stronger system, so, like democracy and capitalism, as opposed to
because anytime I hear, like you said, a communist being like, oh, if it wasn't for X, Y, and Z, the whole world would be global communism right now. And in my mind, I just think about like, well, that sounds as similar to me as like if a fascist said, if it wasn't for XYZ, we'd be living in Wolfenstein right now and everything would be paradise. You know, the Germans would like rule everything. I'm like, yeah, but they didn't. They lost. So what's your point? It's like always how I like lead it up to that. It's like, all right, cute.
I also think that, like, paradoxically, part of what the things that make fringe ideologies and like violent ideologies more visible to all of us is probably one of the reason why it's less likely to like do a dramatic takeover or whatever, because it's the online factor. It's because so many people are like with Twitter and with social media in general, and the internet, there's so many people who use it as kind of an identity builder and just to kind of express their aggression, but at the same time but they're managing to do it all like by LARPing on Twitter, so there's no actually need for them. Like that's what they're spending their time doing. So they're obviously it's almost like an expression of their anger, so they're doing that in substitute of, and I think this is good, of like actually doing or when it's good when it comes to fascists, for example, but in substitute of doing actual like organizing or like actual violence. Like it seems like almost a lot of people with like, so in some ways it seems like it makes it less likely because it kind of makes it kind of translates a lot of like energy for radical politics into just the void of the internet where everything is fake. So like instead of Nazis and communists like killing each other on the street or whatever, they're just like insulting each other on like Twitter and like saying that they're gonna kill each other, but like all on Twitter and like not leaving their house or whatever.
So I might think that democracy is maybe a tad bit more vulnerable than Silver Rose does. I think we certainly have some, like we've argued to some degree about. I still have enough of my resist lib credentials to be a little bit worried about the possibility of backsliding in the United States. And I think that what that doesn't square with is that in this age of the internet, right? Like, so I'm not talking about the overarching trend of history, right? If you look back to like 1900, certainly today is much, much, much more democratic than it was then. But if you look just in like the last few years, we have seen a trend of autocratic backsliding. Since about maybe 2010 or so, the world has gotten more autocratic. So places like Hungary, India, Poland, Tunisia, places that were once liberal democracies have now backslid more. And this is in the age of the internet. And at the same time, since about the Iranian Revolution in 1979 was probably the beginning of the rise in global jihadism, both among Sunnis and Shias. So suicide bombing was first developed by actually Shia extremists. It's now primarily known in Lebanon. It's now primarily known for being common among Sunnis, these suicide attacks, culminating, of course, in 9/11. So we've seen a rise in that concurrent with the rise of technology and more shared information. And what we've also seen in the United States, we've seen declining church attendance in a lot of these mainline churches and declining church attendance overall, but we've actually seen a rise in evangelical church attendance. So we're seeing like increased polarization, maybe with respect to religion and to technology and to rejection of the modern world. So I don't know that I fully agree that the kind of internet extremism is so benign. I kind of disagree with that.
I feel especially like you are right, democracy is starting to have its cracks where it's going to be able to slip through maybe, but I'd agree with Derek on that one, that I do believe democracy has potentiality. Keyword, potentiality. I'm not banking either way or the other. I'm pretty neutral on it. That it could fall through, which I wouldn't really care either way if it did, because I've seen a lot of flaws in democracy as well as a system. But that's just from a lot of reading of like, the Greek philosophers and going in later to like Hans Hermann Hoppe and people like that who have their critiques on it. And it's interesting because there's a lot of systems that we take for granted, we don't pay attention to, that is very pinnacle in our day-to-day lives that we don't really think of alternatives for. Like most of the time when I say like, yeah, I'm not really for democracy, everyone's knee-jerk reaction is like, oh, without democracy, what do you want then? A dictatorship? And then it's kind of like I gotta sit there and look at them baffled, like, there's more than two options besides democracy.